A woman wants the M249? That's hilarious. That was the joke, the punchline that echoed through the barracks when Claire Donovan first asked for heavy weapons training. To them, she was just another quiet private, good for logistics, not for fire. But war has a way of exposing what mockery hides. 6 months later, when mortars shattered the dawn and enemy guns rained fire from the hills, it wasn't the men who had laughed who stood behind the machine gun. It was Claire. For 4 relentless hours, she poured fire into 18 enemy positions, holding the line alone and saving 100 lives. The irony? The voices that once laughed had gone silent, replaced by awe. Because in crisis, true strength speaks louder than prejudice. The desert air at Forward Operating Base Kestrel carried a strange stillness in the early mornings. The mountains of Afghanistan rose jagged and unforgiving around the outpost, and the sun, when it finally broke over the ridges, washed the camp in sharp, unmerciful light. To most soldiers, mornings meant routine, cleaning rifles, checking gear, joking with squad mates, and enduring the monotony that came before the inevitable chaos of war. But for Private First Class Claire Donovan, mornings often carried something else: silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that comes when others dismiss you, when their voices are lowered only to mock and rise only to laugh. Claire had learned to endure it. She was quiet, disciplined, and sharp, yet underestimated in every way that mattered. Around the barracks, she was the one assigned to logistics, supply checks, and paperwork. Some of her peers saw her as reliable but unremarkable. A soldier, yes, but not the kind they imagined carrying the squad's heavy firepower. Certainly not the type to shoulder the M249, the weapon they liked to call the squad's roar. When she had once requested training on that machine gun, the response had been met not with consideration, but derision. "A woman wants the M249? That's hilarious." The line had echoed in the barracks, the laughter spilling over like it was entertainment. Even her staff sergeant had joined in, shaking his head with the certainty of a man convinced by old prejudices. The idea that she could manage 22 pounds of steel and firepower was, to them, laughable. But Claire never argued back. She knew words wouldn't change their minds. She let the laughter fall against her like rain on stone, absorbing it quietly, hiding the fire that smoldered deep within. What they didn't understand was that she had been training for this kind of doubt her entire life. Claire Donovan had grown up far from war, on a wide stretch of ranch land in Wyoming. Her family's cattle operation demanded grit from the moment the sun rose until it fell behind the hills. There were no excuses on the Donovan ranch, only chores that had to be done, calves that had to be fed, and fences that had to be repaired in the biting cold of winter or the blazing heat of July. But the most profound lessons came not from the land, but from her grandfather, Sergeant Major William Donovan, retired Vietnam machine gunner. To the outside world, he was a weathered old man who rarely spoke of the jungles he had fought through. But to Claire, he was a living monument to discipline, toughness, and courage. It was William who first placed a rifle in her hands. She had been small, barely strong enough to hold it steady, but his steady voice had guided her. "Little soldier," he used to say, "the biggest gun in the world is useless if the person behind it doesn't have the heart to use it when it matters most." Weekends on the ranch became lessons in marksmanship. Her grandfather's fields were turned into improvised ranges where she learned not only how to aim and fire, but how to read the wind, how to control her breathing, and how to maintain calm under pressure. Sometimes he would set up moving targets, forcing her to adapt. Other times he would deliberately distract her, shouting or clapping, testing her focus. Claire grew up learning that shooting was not about brute strength, but about discipline. It was about holding steady when the world shook around you. Those lessons dug deep, shaping not only her skills with a weapon, but her entire outlook on life. Years later in Afghanistan, those early lessons felt like a hidden secret, one she carried quietly while others overlooked her. Around the base, her peers only saw a logistics soldier. They watched her stack crates, tally supplies, and ensure gear was accounted for. They saw competence but not capability. At night in the barracks, when soldiers bragged about firefights and weapons, Claire often stayed silent. She remembered her grandfather's words, how heart mattered more than muscle. But she also knew silence had its power. To her, every sneer, every dismissive joke was fuel. It was a test, just like the ones her grandfather used to set. And yet, beneath the calm surface, there was always tension. Because war, unlike ranch life, was not patient. It didn't wait for you to prove yourself on your own timeline. It thrust you into moments that demanded everything in an instant. Claire knew deep down that one day the desert would burn with that test. One day the laughter would stop and her chance would come. On the morning of June 14th, the base carried the same routine as always. Soldiers joked over rations, the armory clattered with the sound of rifles being cleaned, and the radio buzzed faintly with static reports. Claire was there, sitting quietly with her M4, running her cleaning kit over the barrel, her eyes calm but distant. None of them knew what was coming. None of them imagined that by sunrise the next day, the base would be engulfed in smoke, mortars screaming overhead, enemy guns flashing from the hills. And none of them imagined that the same quiet private they dismissed would be the one to stand alone at the gun, silencing 18 enemy positions and saving 100 lives. For now, all they saw was the quiet soldier in logistics. But war has a way of exposing what mockery hides. The morning of the attack began deceptively calm. A pale dawn crept across the Afghan mountains, and the base stirred with its usual rhythm. Boots scuffing gravel, metal clanging from the motor pool. The muted chatter of soldiers preparing for another day of routine. Claire Donovan sat quietly at the eastern perimeter, her M4 resting across her lap, eyes fixed on the horizon. There was a certain heaviness in the air, the kind that soldiers learn not to ignore. Then the sky split open. The first mortar landed in the center courtyard with a concussive blast that sent dust and fire hurtling into the air. Claire felt the shock wave slam against her chest, knocking the breath from her lungs. Before she could process it, a second explosion tore through the motor pool, igniting fuel drums and a violent fireball. The alarm shrieked across the base. "Incoming! All personnel to defensive positions!" Within moments, chaos erupted. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting over the deafening thunder of shell after shell. The air filled with acrid smoke, burning fuel, and the sharp metallic scent of blood. Automatic fire cracked from the surrounding hills. Through the haze, Claire spotted it, dozens of muzzle flashes flaring like angry stars across the ridgelines. The enemy had surrounded the base overnight, carefully setting up overlapping fields of fire. It was a trap meticulously sprung. She dropped to her belly and crawled toward the eastern wall. But her eyes caught on something critical. The M249 squad automatic weapon, lying abandoned in the dirt, its barrel blackened with dust, its bipod still braced on the sandbags. Next to it, Corporal Avery, the gun's operator, clutched his shoulder, blood seeping through his uniform where shrapnel had torn deep. The weapon was still functional. Its belt feed lay ready, a serpent of brass cartridges gleaming in the firelight. The gun was silent now, but the enemy fire pouring from the hills screamed why it couldn't stay that way. Claire's heart pounded. She had asked for training on this very weapon months ago. She had been mocked for it, denied, told she wasn't strong enough, wasn't built for the beast. But here it was, abandoned at the worst possible moment, and here she was, the only one close enough to take it. "Claire!" Corporal Avery's voice rasped through clenched teeth. "Leave it. Get to command. You're not trained." Before she could answer, her radio crackled. "Eastern Sector, report." The voice of Staff Sergeant Morgan, heavy with tension. Claire grabbed the handset. "This is Donovan. Gunners down. The 249 is unmanned." A pause, then a sharp reply. "Reed, you're not qualified on the 249. Hand it to someone trained." Her eyes darted to the ridges. She counted muzzle flashes. 15, maybe 20 enemy positions hammering down fire. Soldiers around her hugged the dirt, pinned. No one else was near enough. No one else was free. If that weapon stayed silent, the eastern perimeter would collapse within minutes. Claire's jaw clenched. She pressed the radio again. "Command, listen to me. If I don't fire this gun, they'll overrun us. I'm the only one here." Static filled the line before Captain Blake's voice cut through. "Donovan, do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. You're not qualified. You'll waste ammunition." Her hands shook with anger, but her voice came steady, cold as steel. "If I don't fire, we all die. Without another word, she slung her M4 over her back and sprinted through the storm. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet. A rocket-propelled grenade screeched overhead and detonated against a wall, showering her with debris. Adrenaline surged, drowning out fear, driving her legs forward. She dove behind the sandbags, landing hard beside the abandoned M249. Her hands gripped the weapon's cool steel, the weight of it anchoring her in that moment. She set her cheek against the stock, breath ragged, heartbeat hammering in her ears. She remembered her grandfather's words. The biggest gun in the world is useless without heart. She had heart, and now she had the gun. The first burst rattled through her bones. The weapon bucked violently, the roar deafening, the muzzle flash painting her face in strobe-like fury. The recoil was heavier than anything she'd fired before, but her arms and will locked it steady. She swept the barrel across the ridge where enemy tracers burned like fireflies. The M249 spat a stream of lead, and one by one, the hostile flashes dimmed. "Eastern position engaging," Claire shouted into the radio between bursts. "Target suppressed. Send resupply." For a moment silence hung, then Sergeant Morgan's voice returned, tinged with disbelief. "Command copies. Eastern position. Hold the line." Around her, soldiers lifted their heads, emboldened by the thunder of the squad automatic weapon. It wasn't just a gun, it was a statement, a wall of fire that clawed back space for them to breathe, to fight. The chaos of the battlefield hadn't lessened. The mortars still rained, enemy rounds still tore the air. But Claire had carved order out of it. Her stand had turned the tide, if only for the moment. Behind her, wounded Corporal Avery stared, grimacing through pain. "Damn, Donovan, you're really doing it." Claire didn't answer. She couldn't afford to. Every second, every trigger pull mattered. She knew the truth. If she faltered, if she let the weapon fall silent again, the enemy would surge forward and the base would fall. So she kept firing, each burst an answer to the laughter that once mocked her. Each muzzle flash a reminder that heart and courage weighed more than prejudice. And in that firestorm, Claire Donovan made her stand. The first burst was messy. The M249 kicked like a wild animal, the recoil slamming into Claire Donovan's shoulder with unforgiving violence. Her cheek rattled against the stock. Her hands trembled as she tried to steady the weapon. The initial round sprayed wide, ripping into sand and stone rather than striking true. For a moment, doubt flared. Had command been right? Was she in over her head? But then, through the haze, one muzzle flash winked out. The enemy's machine gun nest, which had been hammering at the northern sector, went silent. Claire blinked, breath catching in her throat. That wasn't luck, that was her. She had silenced a gun position that had pinned her fellow soldiers for minutes. In war, minutes could mean lives. The next burst was sharper. She adjusted her grip, pressing the stock tighter against her shoulder, bracing her elbows into the dirt. She remembered her grandfather's voice on the ranch. "Breathe with the rifle, control it, don't fight it." She inhaled, let her chest expand, then squeezed the trigger again. This time the rounds cut a controlled arc across another enemy position. More flashes dimmed. By the third burst, Claire had found her rhythm. The M249's roar became less alien, more like a rhythm she could bend to her will. The recoil was still punishing, her arms burned from the strain, but her mind adapted faster than her body. She learned to ride the weapon rather than resist it. Short, disciplined bursts instead of reckless sprays. Minutes bled into hours. The firefight showed no mercy, stretching into an unrelenting contest of endurance. Claire's world narrowed to the gun, the sandbags and the ridgelines crawling with muzzle flashes. She fired, paused to reload, then fired again. Every belt of ammunition felt like a lifeline. Brass casings piled around her, hot against her arms and legs. Smoke stung her eyes, her hearing faded into a constant ringing, but her focus sharpened with every trigger pull. For 4 relentless hours, she held that position. 18 separate enemy nests went silent under her suppressive fire. Soldiers who had been pinned down managed to move, to breathe, to fight back. Behind her, wounded men dragged themselves to safety. Around her, the eastern perimeter, once moments from collapse, held steady. Suppressive fire is not just about bullets, it's about psychology. One person with the right weapon can dominate the minds of hundreds. The rattle of the M249 was more than noise, it was a message. To the enemy it said, if you move, you die. If you expose yourself, you won't make it back. That message seeped into the hills. Fighters who had surged forward with confidence now hugged the dirt, frozen in place. Some tried to crawl to shift position, but Claire's burst found them, her rhythm relentless. Every shot didn't need to kill. It only needed to remind them that death was waiting if they dared rise. War at its core is about momentum. Before the M249 roared to life, the enemy had it. They advanced with confidence, raining fire into the base. But Claire's fire turned that momentum on its head. Suddenly, hundreds of men were stalled by one soldier. The battle shifted, not in numbers, not in terrain, but in spirit. Historians have often said that machine guns define modern warfare. They do not simply shoot, they sculpt the battlefield. A single automatic weapon, well placed, can anchor an entire defense. Claire's fight was a textbook demonstration of this truth. With the M249, she created what commanders call a wall of fire. It didn't just protect her, it reshaped enemy behavior. Attacks slowed, movements grew hesitant, and coordination broke down. By forcing the enemy to stay low, she gave her comrades time to regroup and counterattack. The M249 wasn't just a weapon of destruction, it was a weapon of control. Claire wielded it not as a novice, but as if she had trained for years. Her bursts were disciplined, her target selection deliberate. She became, in effect, the backbone of the base's defense. Still, the weapon alone was not enough. Machine guns demand more than muscle. They demand resolve. The heat from the barrel burned her hands even through gloves. The recoil bruised her shoulder until every movement throbbed. Sweat dripped into her eyes, mixing with dust and gun oil. Most would have faltered. Most would have handed the gun to another, or let exhaustion dictate retreat. Claire did not. She understood that the weapon was only as strong as the will behind it, and her will was unbreakable. Her courage turned chaos into order. Soldiers who had once dismissed her now found themselves relying on her. Command channels buzzed with updates about the Eastern gun. Snipers radioed confirmation that enemy fighters were bunching up, paralyzed by her fire. Even the captain, who had ordered her not to engage, acknowledged her as the pivot point of the defense. In that storm of bullets and explosions, Claire spoke a language older than words. Fire was her voice. Each burst was a declaration. I will not break. This line will not fall. To the enemy, it was a sentence. Stay down or die. To her fellow soldiers, it was a promise. You are not alone. Hours into the siege, the field was littered with silence where enemy guns had once barked. The ridges that had glowed with muzzle flashes were now scarred and smoldering. And still, Claire remained at her post, eyes narrowed, fingers steady, every nerve alight with focus. When the battle reports were later compiled, commanders marveled at the efficiency of her fire. But statistics could never capture the reality. One underestimated private had frozen hundreds of enemy fighters, not with rank or orders, but with sheer will and the roar of her gun. That day, Claire Donovan didn't just fire bullets. She spoke a language that only the battlefield understood, and everyone, friend and foe alike, heard it loud and clear. The hours ground on like a punishment. Every second behind the M249 felt like a lifetime. Every burst of fire, another toll taken on Claire Donovan's body. Her shoulder had turned purple beneath the uniform, each recoil pounding into the bone as if it were a hammer against fragile wood. Her hands cramped from gripping the pistol grip and feeding belts into the receiver, the tendons straining, trembling as though they might simply give out. Her ears rang with a constant, merciless tone, drowning out most of the battlefield. Only the M249's roar remained clear, cutting through the haze like the voice of survival itself. Her body was breaking, but her will was not. Claire stayed low against the sandbags, cheeks smeared with dirt, lips cracked and bleeding. Every part of her screamed for rest, for 1 second to unclench her muscles, to let the weapon fall silent. But she knew what silence meant. Silence was death. If the gun stopped firing, the enemy would surge again, pouring through the breaches, overwhelming the wounded and exhausted soldiers behind her. So she kept firing. Short bursts, disciplined arcs. Her finger moved with machine-like rhythm, even as her body threatened collapse. Ammunition was life, and life was running low. Empty boxes lay scattered around her, brass casings piled knee-high in the dirt. Claire slapped the radio, voice hoarse. "Eastern position, running dry. Request immediate resupply." The reply came almost instantly. "Hold on, Donovan, we're sending it." A shadow moved in the dust. Private Torres, crawling across open ground with 2 ammo cans strapped to his back. Enemy tracers carved the air around him, dirt erupting with every near miss. Still he crawled, inch by inch, until he reached Claire's position. He shoved the cans forward, breath ragged. "Here, you've got to keep that gun singing." Claire locked eyes with him, nodded once, and fed the fresh belt into the weapon. Her hands bled where the sharp links had cut her skin, but she ignored the sting. The M249 thundered back to life, spewing fire across the hills. Torres collapsed beside her, chest heaving, but the faintest grin touched his lips. "Never thought I'd live to see the quiet one outgun us all." High above, a 2-man sniper team had been watching. Their spotter's scope followed the ridgelines, tracking the enemy as they attempted to maneuver. The sniper's voice cut over the command channel. "Overwatch to command. Eastern gun has neutralized at least 14 enemy nests. They're bunching up now, afraid to move. Donovan's fire is keeping them pinned." Static followed, then the captain's voice. "Copy that. Without her, we're done here." Those words rippled across the net, a tacit admission that the base's survival hinged not on rank or strategy, but on one underestimated private with a machine gun. By the 3rd hour, Claire's arms shook violently with every burst. She had to bite her lip until it bled just to keep her focus. The heat from the barrel forced her to rotate it, changing out spares under fire while her fingers fumbled from exhaustion. Each reload felt slower, clumsier, but still she managed, driven by something beyond muscle memory. Her vision blurred from sweat and smoke, but her mind stayed locked on one mantra: hold the line. She thought of her grandfather's words, echoing through the years. Heart, not strength. She clung to that truth as her lifeline. The enemy knew she was the anchor. Mortars redirected toward her position, exploding so close that sandbags disintegrated, pelting her face with grit. Shrapnel tore her sleeve and sliced across her arm, blood trickling down, but she barely noticed. Pain was irrelevant. Survival was not. Inside the command bunker, officers pored over radio reports, their maps littered with markers of advancing enemy units. Each sector had taken heavy casualties, each position strained. Yet the East, Claire's sector, still held. "Every push they've made has stalled against her," Lieutenant Chen muttered, astonished. "She's holding back an entire company." Captain Blake exhaled sharply. "We gave the order for her not to engage." Rodriguez, crouched nearby, shook his head. Good thing she didn't listen. It was no longer speculation. The truth was clear. Without Claire Donovan and her relentless wall of fire, the base would already have collapsed. At last, a voice cut through the chaos on the net, calm, controlled, and welcome beyond words. "This is Falcon Flight, 2 minutes out. Mark enemy positions for close air support." Relief surged through the base, but 2 minutes in battle might as well have been 2 hours. The enemy, realizing air support was inbound, launched one final desperate push. Dozens of fighters rose from the hills, charging forward in a human wave, RPGs firing, rifles blazing. Claire saw them through the smoke, a flood of shadows surging down the ridges. Her entire body ached, her lungs burned, her ears screamed with ringing. She could barely keep her hands steady on the trigger, but she didn't stop. She opened fire, sweeping the M249 in disciplined arcs, cutting down the charge before it could reach the wire. Tracers carved through the smoke, striking dirt, stone, and men alike. Her body felt like it was unraveling, muscle by muscle, nerve by nerve, but her spirit held firm. Behind her, soldiers found courage in her defiance. They rose from cover, firing rifles, tossing grenades, rallying around the thunder of her gun. Then finally, the sky split with the scream of jets. Precision strikes hammered the hillsides, detonations lighting the horizon in waves of fire. Enemy formations shattered under the bombardment. their will to fight evaporating in smoke and flame. Claire, chest heaving, let the M249 fall silent for the first time in 4 hours. Around her lay mountains of brass, empty boxes, in the echoes of defiance. She had endured long enough for the cavalry to arrive, long enough to save the base. Her body might have been broken, but her will had kept hundreds alive. The battlefield after air support was unrecognizable. Smoke drifted like ghosts over shattered ridgelines, the echo of detonations still rolling through the mountains. Burned-out trucks smoldered in the distance, their twisted frames black against the pale dawn. The silence that followed felt heavier than the firefight itself, a suffocating reminder of how close death had come. Claire Donovan lay sprawled behind the M249, chest heaving, body trembling with exhaustion. Her uniform was torn, her shoulder bruised dark from recoil, her arms streaked with blood where shrapnel and brass had cut into her skin. Around her, empty ammo cans and mountains of spent casings told the story better than words could. She had stood alone at the wall and turned chaos into survival. When the first medics reached her, they expected to find a soldier barely conscious. Instead, Claire lifted her head, voice hoarse but steady. "Check the others first. I'll live." That simple sentence spoke louder than any after-action report ever could. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at Forward Operating Base Kestrel spread quickly. At first it was whispers. That was Donovan on the 249. Then it became fact, backed by intelligence reports and confirmed enemy casualties. Over 18 positions destroyed, hundreds pinned down, an entire garrison saved. 6 weeks later, under the unforgiving Afghan sun, the base assembled in formation. Captain Blake stepped forward, the Bronze Star in hand, his voice formal, but his expression heavy with humility. "Specialist Claire Donovan," he announced, "for valor in the face of overwhelming enemy assault, for holding the line when others could not, and for saving over 100 American lives. You are awarded the Bronze Star with V device." The applause that followed was not the rowdy kind soldiers often gave. It was measured, reverent, almost solemn. Among the clapping hands were the very men who had once laughed at her request to train on the M249. Now they looked at her with something else entirely, respect born of survival. Recognition wasn't the end, it was the beginning. Almost immediately, Claire was enrolled in official M249 training. This time, no one questioned her presence in the classroom. When she gripped the weapon during drills, instructors recognized she was not learning from scratch. She was refining instincts honed under fire. Months later, she became the squad's official machine gunner. Later still, she was selected as an instructor at the Army's heavy weapons school. Young recruits, men and women alike, listened as she taught them not just about the mechanics of suppressive fire, but about discipline, focus, and heart. She demonstrated techniques she had discovered on the battlefield, methods not even written in the manuals. Her story became more than personal triumph. It became a symbol. For years, unspoken stereotypes had lingered in the ranks, that some weapons, some roles were too much for women. Claire Donovan shattered that illusion in a single battle. She proved that willpower, training, and courage outweighed muscle or gender. What she accomplished with the M249 wasn't a statement about equality, it was proof of reality. On that day, survival didn't care about preconceptions. Leadership didn't come from rank, and firepower didn't come from brute strength. It came from the heart to keep fighting when every nerve in the body begged to stop. History has always remembered the underestimated. Time and again, those dismissed as unworthy became the decisive factor. Farmers at Lexington, nurses on the front lines of World War II, resistance fighters in occupied cities. Claire Donovan joined that lineage. A quiet private mocked for wanting too much became the anchor of a battle that could have been lost. Her story reminds us that underestimation is dangerous, not for the individual, but for those who depend on them. Because when crisis comes, the overlooked often rise higher than anyone expects. As the ceremony ended, Claire looked across the rows of soldiers. She saw familiar faces, the same ones who had laughed in the barracks months ago. Their expressions now carried none of the arrogance of before. They weren't laughing. They were remembering the thunder of her gun, the shield of her courage, the hours she bought them with every ounce of her strength. The final truth lingered like smoke in the air. They mocked her request. They honored her sacrifice. Claire Donovan's story is more than a tale of bravery under fire. It's a mirror held up to all of us. On the battlefield, she was dismissed, mocked, and overlooked, until the moment came when her courage became the difference between life and death. That same truth reaches far beyond Afghanistan. It speaks to the way we live today. How many times in our modern world do we dismiss someone because of surface judgments? A young worker at the office who's too quiet to lead. An older neighbor we think is past their prime. A woman told she's not strong enough for certain roles. Time and again, people are underestimated until circumstances reveal the depth of their skill, their wisdom, or their determination. For older generations in America especially, Claire's story carries weight. Many of you have lived long enough to see how easily society forgets the value of experience. Yet, like Claire, you know that strength is not always visible on the surface. Sometimes it reveals itself only when the storm hits. Her battle reminds us that stereotypes, whether about gender, age, or background, are fragile illusions shattered by truth. But there's another layer here: responsibility. Claire didn't fight because she wanted recognition. She fought because others needed her to. That sense of duty, of stepping up when it would be easier to step back, is something our communities need today. Whether it's serving in local organizations, mentoring the younger generation, or simply standing firm in your values, the call to hold the line is timeless. So let me ask you directly, have you ever been underestimated only to prove people wrong? Or have you ever realized you misjudged someone else, only to be humbled by their strength? These are the conversations worth having, not just about war, but about everyday life. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Share them because someone out there might need the encouragement your words can bring. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you reflect on courage, stereotypes, or even your own past, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you care about. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the strongest voice is the one no one expected to hear.